Argentina spent what they didn't have, leading to a total breakdown. Then they did it again and again, totaling 9 different catastrophes. Greece followed the same path of reckless leverage, resulting in a 25% economic contraction and a mass exodus of its youth, only to vanish from the map after spending 40 years, handing every cent of tax revenue to foreign financiers. From Mexico to Brazil and Venezuela, the 1980s saw an entire region crumble into what historians now call the lost decade. Here at the Economic of Fallen Empires, we track these recurring nightmares because the banking elite recognizes the script perfectly. They've watched this tragedy play out for centuries. There is a relentless rhythm to history, a snare so predictable that experts can see it coming from miles away. The blueprint never changes. Leaders take out massive loans to fund grand promises. The public enjoys a brief artificial high, and then the inevitable invoice arrives. Usually, it starts with a jolt to the system of conflict, a market crash, or a sudden emergency. Global lenders then appear like vultures, offering lifelines with terms that seem reasonable on the surface. Soon, the IMF enters the room with spreadsheets and demands for austerity. Chaos fills the streets, the government admits it's broke, and the treasury is picked clean. A few years pass, memories fade, and the cycle resets. This isn't a theory. It is the lived reality of the debt trap, and it is happening right now. Look at Argentina, the undisputed heavyweight champion of going bust. 9 times they have looked at the world and said, "We're not paying." To understand this addiction, you have to look back at 1913, when Argentina was an economic titan. It was wealthier than Germany or France, fueled by an endless sea of grain and cattle. They built grand opera houses to mimic the elegance of Paris, but the foundation was hollow. Their entire existence relied on selling raw goods to Europe. When the World Wars and the Depression choked off trade, the facade shattered. Their first failure was in 1827 after a war with Brazil. Their second in 1890 after. A railway bubble burst so spectacularly it nearly dragged down the London banking system. By the 20th century, Argentina had turned failure into an art form. From military juntas printing worthless paper to the populist era of Juan Perón, the strategy was always the same. Buy short-term loyalty with borrowed money. By the 1980s, the country was drowning. Inflation hit a staggering 3,000%. A decade later, they tried to trick the world again by pegging their currency to the US dollar. It created a temporary illusion of wealth, but the cost of maintaining that lie required even more debt. The country saw 5 presidents in 2 weeks and a record-breaking $93 billion default. Even the 2020 pandemic saw them trip into their 9th bankruptcy. For the ruling class in Argentina, reduced to a global cautionary tale while its citizens watch their life savings vanish. The Ottoman Empire provides an even darker look at how debt erases sovereignty. In 1875, their bankruptcy didn't just hurt the wallet. It killed the empire. For centuries, the sultans expanded through the sword, using new lands to fill their coffers. But when the borders stopped moving, the revenue dried up. To maintain their massive military and suppress revolts, they turned to the bankers of London and Paris, Starting in the 1850s, the sultans fell in love with easy credit. They claimed the money was for railroads and modernity, but much of it vanished into palace luxuries and bribes. By 1875, half of all imperial revenue was being swallowed by interest payments alone. When they finally admitted they couldn't pay, the humiliation was total. Foreigners moved into Istanbul, set up the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, and began siphoning off taxes on tobacco, salt, and silk before the Sultan could even touch them. The empire became a sick man, propped up by its creditors, until it finally disintegrated after World War I. The debt lived longer than the empire itself, with modern Turkey still paying off those Victorian-era loans well into the 20th century. The 1980s Latin American crisis proved this wasn't just an isolated problem. It was a global contagion. It was triggered by petrodollars. When oil prices spiked in the 70s, Arab nations flooded Western banks with cash. Those banks, desperate to move the money, shoved loans down the throats of every government from Mexico to Chile. It seemed like a win-win until 1979, when the U.S. Fed hiked interest rates to 21%. Suddenly, the cost of those loans exploded, while the prices of the copper and coffee these nations sold plummeted. In 1982, Mexico's finance minister flew to D.C. to deliver the bomb. They were out of money. The ensuing lost decade saw wages drop by 40% and poverty explode. The banks were eventually bailed out by the Brady Plan, but the people were left with the bill. Even modern Europe isn't safe. In 2010, Greece became the new face of this old horror. They used accounting gymnastics and the help of Wall Street firms like Goldman Sachs to sneak into the Eurozone. They spent years living a lie, funded by cheap credit, until the 2008 crash forced the world to look at their books. Greece was trapped. Unlike Argentina, they couldn't print their own money to escape. They were forced into internal devaluation, slashing pensions, cutting wages, and watching unemployment hit 27%. The result was a social collapse more severe than the Great Depression. Because the incentives are broken, a politician only needs to look good for the next election. The debt crisis usually happens long after they've retired. Lenders make massive profits on the way up and get rescued by taxpayers on the way down. Today, the world is buried under $337 trillion in debt, over 3 times the entire planet's economic output. From the collapse of Lebanon and Sri Lanka to the soaring deficits in the U.S. and Japan, the trap is closing again. At the Economic of Fallen Empires, we believe history doesn't just repeat. It rhymes. The only uncertainty is which nation will be the next to see its foundations crumble under the weight of its promises. If this breakdown of the debt cycle hit home, make sure to subscribe to the Economic of Fallen